And with that, we're rolling. So welcome to episode 2 of the succession planning series, which are posted on Community Futures YouTube channel, which all of you who register, I send that to you. We've got Shauna Feth coming back today from the University of Alberta, the Alberta Family Business Institute. Last week we did the 3-circle model, which was fantastic. And today we're doing what are we doing today?
Family business systems.
Family business systems. Excellent. Okay, with that, I know you have an hour of material. So if anybody wants to put stuff into the chat, by all means, go ahead. And I'll turn it over to Shauna and we'll get rolling. Thanks, Shauna.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael. So excited to be here again. I'm just going to start my share here. And so excellent. Thank you so much for having me back. It's my pleasure to be here. I hope you enjoyed last session. And this week we're going to do a bit deeper dive, but I'm going to, I guess, put an amendment on this that I boiled this 1-hour presentation down from what is actually a 16-hour masterclass course. So you're getting just the really, really high level Cliff Notes version. In a really kind of quick way. And then I have a few videos that I'll share as we go through with the intent that at the end of it, you have some understanding of the complexities in each of the 3 circles, the family, business, and ownership circle, but you also have some understanding of some of the key conversations that need to take place, and also some of the key governance structures that we could apply to support family enterprises as they look at transition and succession planning. So we are in a webinar, you guys are all aware of this, but if you do have a question, I think you can put your hand up to talk, or if not, you can log the question in the chat box and Michael will get to those as we go through. And I'll take some stops throughout, Michael, to just check in to see if we have any of those questions. And then if not, I'll make sure that I attempt to leave at least a few minutes at the end of the presentation for any questions you may have. So this is me. I'm not going to go into too much detail. I'm born into a 3rd-generation family business. I've been running the Alberta Business Family Institute for now about 15 years. I've been a co-owner of several oil fields servicing companies, which is now a diversified apiary, and I'm heavily involved with the Chambers of Commerce at all 3 levels, locally, provincially, and nationally, as well as I sit on several advisory boards. So I just want to do a refresh of what we learned last week, because this is really the framework for everything that we do. So those of you who weren't with us last week, this is going to be just a really high level Cliff Notes version of it. But for those of you who were with us last week, just a reminder that we're looking at this complex system when we look at family enterprises, and that we have like these 3 different circles that are working with each other, but also competing with resources and priorities. So we have the family circle, the ownership circle, and the business circle. And within this model, there are 7 different positions that you could be in. So number 1, you are a family member, which means you're not working in the business, you don't own shares. Number 2, you're in ownership. So that would be an external owner, investors that are not family and don't work in the business. Number 3 are those key non-family employees. So those people who are working in the business, but they're not part of the family and they don't own shares. Number 4 is a family member who owns shares but isn't working in the business. Number 5 is an employee who owns shares, so like ESOPs in Alberta, any of those types of arrangements. Number 6 is a family member who's working in the business and doesn't own shares. And then number 7 are all of those owner founders or those senior generations who they're in the family, they're running the business, and they own the shares. And so I just want to remind you about the truisms in this model. The first one being that conflict is inevitable. We know that, and we need to ensure that those families that we're working with know that it's inevitable too, and that we normalize it for them. Or any families that are on the call, just know that it's absolutely going to happen as we look at transition and succession planning, because there's individuals' dreams and hopes that we have to deal with, and all of their own perspectives on how transition should take place through this model. The second truism is where you are located, between 1 through 7 in those quadrants directly impacts your view of what's going on and your perspective. So if you could think about that, if I'm a family member in a 1 position, I'm not working in the business, I don't own shares, I probably have a very substantially different perspective about what's happening in transition and succession from that number 7 person, who that owner founder who's got all the skin in the game, is working the 12, 14-hour days to make the business successful. So just keep that in mind too, that it's really, really important to ensure that we honor each person where they're at as we look at all the conversations that need to take place. The next truism is that the lines in this model, as you can see, are dotted. They're permeable. The intent is that as we do work in one circle, the information that we garner out of that work is shared with the other circles. So we make sure that there's a system for sharing all of the information that is coming out of the governance that we're applying in each of the circles. And then finally, just keeping in mind as we look at transitioning, we're actually moving between the circles. So if I'm a family member that's looking at taking on leadership roles in the business, I'm looking at how can I transition from that 1 position to that 6th position? What do I need to be doing? Okay, so that was a really quick overview of the 3-circle model, and just keep that in mind because this is the absolute framework for everything that we're going to talk about today. So let's talk about the family circle first, and what do we need to be thinking about in the family circle? Well, first and foremost, we need to determine the owner or manager's commitment to the transition process. And what I mean by that is that this is really where the rubber meets the road, for lack of a better term. If those founders or if that senior generation is not ready to have this conversation, then it's not going to happen. Quite honestly, I mean, they are the ones that own the shares. They're the ones running the business and are probably heads of their family. If they're not in a headspace or a position to be thinking about transition planning, if they're not there yet, then it's just a waste of time, quite honestly. So how do we actually start that conversation with them? You know, how do we really talk to them about, okay, are you going to retire? Are you ready to retire? When do you want to retire? A lot of times the next generation that's coming up will want to open up these conversations with the senior generation. And we really need to be thinking and be thoughtful about the timelines. You know, once the senior generation is on board and willing to have that conversation, you know, we need to get them to that readiness space. Like, they need to be ready to have the conversation, put some timelines around it, and then so we can really as a family have some good conversation about what does that mean for all of the other individuals in the family circle in terms of what are their opportunities and what are their dreams and hopes for the future of this business. And I said it last time, but again, I come at it from this perspective of that you got to be a family enterprise that really is looking for continuity. They want this business to be a legacy, and they want it to pass down from generation to generation, because all of this work is not worthwhile unless that is the intent. So that question needs to be asked up front, like we talked about last week. And then as we look at that process, we need to be really asking, you know, the founder, all right, what is your timeline like? What is your vision for when you want to have this happen? You know, it's interesting when you get into situations where the senior generation is in their 80s and they're still not willing to have this conversation. Sometimes you have to be a little bit blunt about the fact that, you know, it's going to pass. There's something is going to happen. If there's a life event, something is going to happen one way or another, and not planning for it is creating a lot of difficult situations for your family members. So let's have a conversation about, you know, what does that look like for you? And we really need to be asking them to, I mean, we're talking about entrepreneurs in a lot of cases. If you remember back to the family enterprise model last week, some of these entrepreneurs own 2, 3, 4, 5 businesses, own assets and real estate. And so really expecting that they're just one day, you know, 5 years down the road are just going to hang up their hat and walk away and go golf for the rest of their life is not necessarily realistic. So really, what is that plan for them? Are we ensuring that we, you know, as we're looking at the leadership development in parallel, we're also looking at that development for the senior generation. You know, what is it that you want to do? Is it, you know, do you want to stay on as a mentor, or do you want to stay on the advisory board? Do you want to look at new enterprises or new ventures? You know, do you want to look at, you know, philanthropy and looking more towards giving back, you know, in your senior years? So it's all of those questions that we need to be considering when we're looking at the transition planning. But back to my comment, we need to get that senior generation on board first and foremost, because if we can't do that, then the rest of it is not worth wasting the time on. And so things that we really need to be considerate of as we look at transitioning that senior generation out is that we need to be thoughtful of their personal financial security. So are they going to have enough to retire? Have they put enough personal assets aside? Or is everything, are all the assets invested back into the business? And we need to be thinking about the security of the family. We need to be thinking about the security of the business. So organizationally, as that founder looks at transitioning out, is that business still going to be as viable and vibrant and still growing like it needs to be in order to be successful? And then there's a lot of psychological issues, a lot of psychological security issues that we need to really be paying attention to. Like I said, when all of your identity is wrapped up in that business, how do you, reinvent yourself, and really being thoughtful for these founders about what that means for them, and getting them to, express themselves and have some conversations about what that is going to mean to them going forward. And this really is the basic question. Are they going to require income from the family business? Because this is really important to know. Obviously, when you look to transition shares and ownership to the next generation, in a lot of cases, we're talking about multi-million-dollar businesses. So how do we manage that transition and ensure that if the founders require income from the family business, that they are going to be able to pull that out as needed in a thoughtful, strategic way? And that's where I'm excited about the future sessions that are coming up, because I'm hopeful that some of this will come to light in terms of some of the different ways or different mechanisms that we can support families during transition when they do have a runway of time to be thinking about the best possible way that will align with what the needs and the wants of the family are. But it really is critically important to ask this question. And then after we've done that, so let's just pretend that Yeye, our founder, our senior generation is on board, whatever generation that may be. They're interested in looking at exiting out. We've had those conversations with them. The next thing we need to do is consult and advise the other stakeholders that this is what's happening. This is my vision. This is what we're going to look at going forward. So first of all, with the key family members, and then there's some big questions to be asked here. When you start talking with the key family members, we need to be looking at, how are we distributing the assets, and how are we making those decisions around different loved ones, or a set of siblings, or a set of cousins, depending on what generation they're in. Looking at nepotism and, not just handing over positions to certain family members because they're favored, and making sure that we're being thoughtful about ensuring that those individuals that are going into the business system as leaders, or those individuals that are going into the ownership circle as owners, are properly prepared and have been given the time to build their capabilities and capacity to be successful in any of those future roles that they may take on. And then how are we assessing the abilities for potential successors? Because let's be honest, sometimes it's really tough for us to choose between our children if that's the case. So how are we actually putting mechanisms in place so that we can fairly assess? And what other support or governance structures can be applied that can help us with that? And then just giving voice to the next generation so that they do have the opportunity to express their views and influence some of the decisions that are being made, because a couple things happen here. One is that there's this expectation, so on the part of the senior generation, that of course this son or this daughter is going to take it over. That's just given, but nobody's talked to that child about it. That's just an assumption that's going on. So making sure those conversations are happening. And the assumption goes the other way too, that there may be children who have been working in the business to just assume they're taking on those leadership roles, but don't necessarily have capacity, and those conversations haven't happened either. So really ensuring that we're asking some of these questions and we're providing a forum for the family to have some of these difficult conversations. And then we need to talk about the other stakeholders. Oh, sorry, I went the other way. The senior manager.
Shauna,
so
can I just jump in and interrupt quickly before you change gears a little bit? We have a question. Consult with the family members separately or as a large group, or perhaps both? What have you seen as best in that regard?
Yeah, so we really consult families to, first of all, start with the senior managers to see if they're on board, and then you want to include all of the members in that family system that are going to be impacted. And then the family needs to have a conversation about onboarding or the inclusion of like spouses. They need to talk about onboarding of the next generation. At what age do we bring them into that family circle conversation? So really you have to start with the first conversation, and then it fans out as the family starts to grow and as the next generation starts to grow up. I hope that makes sense. Any other questions, Michael?
Nope, that's it for now.
Okay, all right. So we've talked, the senior generation is on board. We've talked to the family to get some kind of input and feedback from them for where they see themselves in the process. We cannot forget about this has the potential to be a huge crippling agent for transition. Because a lot of times what we see is those senior managers in those critically important roles, if they're not consulted, a lot of times what happens is all of their value is tied to that senior person. All of their contributions, all of the relationship is tied to that senior generation. And they honestly, aren't willing or don't see a real clear path forward for how they're going to work with the next generation. So making sure that we're having those conversations with those senior managers as well, and ensuring that that's taking place in the proper format. So in the business circle, I surface it here within the family circle because, again, it's critically important that we don't forget them, and that the family has some sort of plan for inclusion for the senior leaders. And then one of the first things we need to do is really the determination of the values and the vision and the mission. And I mean this 100% from the family perspective. This is not the business, this is not ownership. This is the family really sitting down and articulating what are our values as a family, what are our values as business owners, as business managers, what does it mean to us in terms of, this business was built for the betterment of the family. So how is the family supporting the proper continuity for the business? And how are we aligning the values for the family and the vision and the mission for the family, which is separate from that of the business? So I just really want to stress that. It's like really thinking about, as a family, here are our values. These are some of the reasons why we're in business. Here are some of our values on how we want to be in the world. Here are some of our values on how we want to support our communities, or whatever the case may be. That is a critical conversation to have and to articulate for the family, so that they in turn can excuse me, sorry, it is a bit of a, they can get that back to the business. And so when you think about the family circle, again, I'm just bringing you in at like the parachute high level on all of this. But when we look at the family, establishing a family meeting or a family council. So in the earlier generations, like G1 to G2, G2 to G3, we usually, it's much more of, a family meeting. It's not this idea of a council. And I'll explain the difference. The difference being that once you look at G3 and you're talking about like a cousin consortium, for instance, you can understand how that's much more complex when you get out of the framework of that nuclear family being the parents and the siblings in G1 and G2. And so what happens is the governance needs to expand so that individual family branches can be represented on a family council. So, in those first generations, it is this idea of a family meeting. So I'm just going to stop sharing there for a second. And I'm just going to share my screen again. I just want to share with you a video. Joe Antrican is considered one of the grandfathers in the field of family business. I just wanted to share his perspective on some of the concepts that I've just shared with you. Mute myself.
A lot of people, when they are in business, particularly founders or energetic next generations, get really stuck in a rut. The rut is, here's what's comfortable to me, and I justify my behavior by the fact that what I'm doing seems to be working. As opposed to saying, here's what I need to be doing to achieve the long-term goals that I have. So when I talk to people, whether it's in speeches or one-on-one, I'll say, what's your long-term goal? My long-term goal is to have a healthy, thriving, surviving business and a family that is together, cohesive, and harmonious. Well, if you want to do that, there are certain things that you need to develop to ensure the business will continue well once you're no longer there to oversee it, and to ensure that the family will continue well once you're no longer there to provide the glue or the conflict management that you provide now. One of them is to develop people underneath you so that they can run the business in your absence, which means you need to step out of doing the day-to-day business things, being the control freak, being the day-to-day manager, making sure nobody makes mistakes, works against your goals of developing a company that can out-survive you. You need people who are comfortable making mistakes and learning from them so they can develop and move forward. You don't need the best possible organization while you're alive. You need the best possible organization that can survive. And to do that, you're going to have to step back. There's no other choice.
So just essentially, just as a recap in the family circle, the main governance is that family meeting. And in that family meeting, we want to do all of those things that I talked about. You know, we want to establish the owner-manager commitment. We want to talk about leadership development. We want to talk about transition planning. We want to talk about retirement considerations. We want to talk about the purchase dynamics and how those shares are going to transfer or transition. So there's a plethora of things that we need to talk about in that family meeting or in that family circle. All right. Moving on. So let's talk now about the business circle. And again, this is really high level stuff. This is a full 16-hour course I'm trying to condense into an hour. So please feel free to ask any questions because I'm not providing as much detail as I would like, obviously. So then let's talk about the business circle. So we've got the family. They have established family meetings. They're having these critical conversations. They've articulated their vision for how they want the transition to go. They've articulated their values and why those are important to them. So now how are we looking at the business circle and managing as I said, the information needs to be shared. How are we managing the information from the family circle over to the business circle to ensure successful continuity? So there again, we need to think about those family values. How are we translating those over to the business and how the business runs? Because, you know, in a lot of situations, the family's name is on that business. So we want to make sure that it's representing the family just as much as a business operation. So we need to do, first of all, you know, as we look at the transition process, so what is that vision for the business? So, you know, the family has said, you know, Joe is retiring out in 5 years. Okay, so the business, where do we want the business to be in 5 years? What is the vision for the business? How are we aligning those values with the business? And how are we creating that corporate culture around those values to ensure that this business will operate from a continuity perspective into the future generations, and that information is being passed down? You know, when you look at values and culture, they're hand in hand. They can't be separated. So ensuring that the values are communicated to the business circle is critically important for these family enterprises, and making sure that those are being aligned with the culture. So, you know, if one of our values as family is that we care about each other and our employees, we better be really exhibiting that in the business, and we better, you know, it better be illustrated in everything that we do and say and every decision we make, that, you know, this is our family value, that are people key for us and we care about them. Well, we better have policies and procedures in place that support that value and that culture. And then we need to think about the successor. So once we kind of have, you know, this higher level idea of the vision and the values and the corporate culture, how does our next generation fit into that? And where do they fit into it? And how do we make those determinations? So when we think about recruiting family members, I just want you to think about a few key things. They should bring, a lot of times we have this conversation with families about this idea of an externship or some time away from the family business to gain some real life experience with another employer. And you know, that life experience, it's not only good for the individuals to in their own self-development, but so many times that experience is so impactful to the business when they come back, because they come back with a fresh set of eyes and they have different perspectives and seeing different ways of operating out in the real world. We really need to ensure that we're creating specific job descriptions. So often what we see in family enterprises is this is just lacking. You know, this type of formality between family members is just not there, which creates in itself a lot of conflict, because if you don't know specifically what your role is and what your expectations are, it's really hard to create accountability amongst family members. So getting really specific around some of those policies and some of those best practices that we should be running our business on, because a lot of times that's not really happening. A lot of times families will specify that their next generation need to come into the job at an entry-level position and work their way up and work their way through, doing things like job shadowing and having mentors within different parts of the organization, depending on how complex it is. So how are we building them up from the ground to really understand the operation of that business over a period of time, you know, grooming them for that leadership role, but also getting them that broader understanding of the operations of the family enterprise. And then, you know, look at assigning a mentor. So again, like I said, those key non-family employees are so critical, because so often they will be those next generation's mentors. A lot of times, you know, I can say a lot of things to my kids, and I think they probably only listen to maybe 25% of them. But, you know, if somebody else says the exact same thing to them, they listen, you know, if it's not me telling them. So we do know that there's that family dynamic going on. So, you know, having those mentors be someone other than a parent. And I say that, but I've also seen situations where that senior generation have just been fantastic mentors to their next generation growing up. So it just depends on the situation and the circumstance and how the communication is between the individuals in the system. And then we need to really be documenting and developing this plan for these next generation successors. So they know what their expectations are, they know what they need to do, and have opportunity to be accountable for their actions and to gain feedback on their performance, because it's critically important. If you're not telling somebody how they're doing, how do they know how they're doing? Well, they're probably making up their own narrative in their head around that. So really critically important amongst family members working together that we can create that level of formality in the system. And then some of the strategies around how we're going to develop these individuals into those roles is really how are we being thoughtful about including them in some of those strategy and planning sessions at high level, so that they can see how the founder, how the senior generation is making some of those critical business decisions, and how to help them with their own thoughtful processes for how decision making should happen. Make sure they're being included in the different business processes. So everything from budgeting to social gatherings, and, you know, finding opportunities for them to shadow at, you know, if you have a board at board meetings, or we'll talk about advisory boards just in a bit here, but how are we giving them those opportunities to shadow and be a part of that conversation as well. And then I've already talked about this, but making sure we just have planned and documented cross-training or interdepartmental rotation plans, so that they know where they're working, what their responsibilities are, what their accountabilities for reporting are, and making sure that we're providing some of that accountability for reporting, so that they start to understand what it means to be a leader in different sections of the business, and what it means to be a leader overall. And so ensuring that we're really providing them with those opportunities, but also providing them with that level of responsibility as we look at going through the transition and succession plan. And again, whatever that vision is, you know, is it 5 years from now? Is it 10 years from now? You know, what often happens is there is no conversation, and then there's a critical event that happens, and we're in a mess where we've got the next generation here potentially in the business, but have had no formal planning or formal training to take over some of those higher level roles and positions, which creates some difficult conversations. So the more that we can talk about this stuff with a runway in time, the much better. That's how much better off the family will be in terms of a really, really positive process. Then we need to talk about, okay, so if you are interested, we'll put these plans in place, but we also have to be thinking from a family perspective about what is our participation policy for our kids coming back into the business or coming into the business? How is compensation determined? What is the process for hiring family members? And then I talked about, our ideas around this idea of mentoring and the continued personal development and making sure that that's being evaluated and feedback is given and accountability is also taken on. And then also we need to talk about confidentiality with when we talk about family members participating in the business, because again, if you've moved into that 6th position, if you remember, you've gone from just being a family member into a 6th position. So now from the business perspective, what are we sharing? What is the disclosure of, financial information? What is that conversation that we're having that when you all of a sudden become privy, when the kimono opens and you actually understand what's going on in the business, how are we sharing that back with the family? And in that group of 6s or 7s, having the conversation about, okay, what are we sharing back to the family? How much disclosure, to what detail and degree we need to be talking about that, which is a really important piece. And confidentiality around this whole system in all the circles is a really important conversation. From the family perspective, what do we share with the business? What do we share with the ownership group if there's people outside the family? We need to have those conversations. And the same with the ownership group. And the key governance to provide a resource for all of this is establishing an advisory board and, of course, establishing management meetings. So within the business, ensuring that all of the individuals in that circle are involved in regular management meetings, because believe it or not, that does not happen. A lot of us live in a world where we have regular check-in meetings with our teams or our groups or with our entire staff. A lot of times this is not happening in family enterprises simply because they're always working together and they feel like they're having those conversations. What you need to do is get really thoughtful about an established scheduled management meeting with just the individuals in that business circle, and then look at the idea of the higher level idea of how an advisory board could support some of those critical decisions that we need to make around successors, around new markets, around all of those things that we need to be thinking about as we look at growing and shaping that business. All right, so I am going to share another video with you, and this just kind of articulates, like leaders replacing leaders. Really, what does it mean to groom that next generation? So again, maybe I'll just stop there, Michael. Are there any other questions before I share the video?
No, we're good to go.
Okay.
Hi, I'm here with Nicole Bettinger-Zeidler from the Family Business Consulting Group, and we're talking about leaders replacing leaders, or what we commonly refer to as Nextgen Development. And I really like this frame of leaders replacing leaders. So, Nicole, how do we develop and grow human capital within a family enterprise?
One of the first steps that a family business needs to take is to figure out what the business itself needs, what sort of skill set, what talent they specifically need to develop within the next generation. From there, you need to clearly define roles and responsibilities. It's tough for a next generation family member to enter the business if there aren't those clear-cut lines, those expectations laid out, any sort of structure. It's very easy then for a next generation family member to flail and to not be successful if there isn't an outline laid out for them.
In this role transition, it's also expectations and defining the business needs. So as these things start to come into play, what does a next-gen leader need to kind of know in order to do these things well?
So a next-gen leader, it first needs to know the family business history. This becomes very important, especially once you're into the third generation beyond, because they probably weren't around when a business was founded or know kind of how the business got to today. So knowing the family history, also knowing all of the family policies from a family employment policy or a shareholder agreement, buy-sell agreement, things like that. They need to know the kind of the lay of the land before they're approaching entering the business. You don't want to kind of throw that at them, right at the point as they're ready to enter the business. They need to know how to get into the business and what will be expected of them before they reach that point. They also need to have some very solid industry knowledge and understanding, as well as kind of what I call business 101, being able to read financial statements, kind of interpret what the financial story is, what that means, before they can successfully become a contributing member of a family business.
So one of the things that you described is really the next-gen leader really needs to know the heart of the business. Mm-hmm. What if the family has had a little bit of lack of transparency, or there's some tight controls around information? How does a next-gen leader kind of enter into that discussion with the older generation?
That's very, very common. That happens quite a bit. And so one tool I like to have the current leadership do is start to map out what they're doing on a day-to-day basis, kind of keep a timeline of the major decisions being made, and then have the next-gen leader be around, just observe, not ask a lot of questions, but just to be in the room when they're making some of those decisions. Then that helps the next-gen family member get a little bit more knowledge so that they have some foundation where they can start this conversation. And then just by being there, that begins to open up a discussion and gives them kind of some meat to talk about, rather than just blatantly asking, well, how did we get here? What does our business do? What do I need to do? That those are big questions that are tough for the current leadership to answer.
Yeah. So I would imagine with the next gens in particular that there's a certain level of social intelligence and emotional intelligence that comes into play in navigating this. So what's that role for the next gen?
It becomes an interesting kind of push-pull dynamic between the current leadership and the next-gen leadership. And this is something that we often talk about as best practices for current leadership, but we don't often talk about what best practices are for the next-gen. So the next-gen, using their emotional intelligence skills and their social intelligence skills, needs to be sensitive to the transition that the current leadership is going through. That they need to show up and hold themselves accountable and be good leaders, be good stewards of their family business, but recognizing that they're not the only ones that are going through something. The current leadership is also experiencing a lot of change. And that's hard, especially for those current leaders that have been in charge for so long or had the only one making decisions. It's very hard for them to open that up to a larger.
It's interesting. Beyond technical competence, I would imagine, in understanding of the business, I would imagine that social and emotional intelligence is one of the critical factors for a successful transition, on both the younger generation and the older generation.
Exactly. Especially as the next gen comes into the business and is taking on more of a leadership role, they may be promoted more quickly than non-family members that have worked for the business for generations, or for years, for decades. So not only does the next gen need to be aware of what their own family is going through, they need to also be aware of what the larger employee group, and especially non-family members, are going through as well.
Yeah, it's a whole systemic awareness and being able to navigate all those multiple relationships. So from a best practices standpoint, real quick, what are like 2 or 3 that you think we can distill down out of this conversation? So going back to what we talked about with the tracking decision making, I like to put all of the decisions and major tasks that the current leadership is doing into a spreadsheet, into a timeline, because then you can really map out what they're doing, and that can map their transition also. So you have a line for current
leadership and then the Nextgen leadership, when they're going to observe these decisions, when they're going to kind of co-team making these decisions, and then when they're going to fully take over making those decisions. The other best practice is to have all of these expectations, how you're going to enter the business, laid out well in advance of a Nextgen family member coming into the business. And that's where a family employment policy becomes key, that maps out requirements for them to enter the business, including outside work experience, or some have an education requirement. Who they're going to work for. Is it a non-family member? Is it a family member? What sort of feedback or review process are they going to have? And then also, which I do this with any agreement that you're entering into with somebody, you also want a way out. So if a family member is entering the business, if it doesn't go well, or they would like to leave the business after all, how do they gracefully exit the business?
So a lot of similar ideas, and just a reframing of some of the things that I was touching on. And I will just share with you too that Nicole is a consultant with Family Business Consulting Group in the States, but she's also a next generation family owner. And I think her family is in 5 or 6 generations. So she's speaking from experience in terms of best practice for what's worked for her family, which is why I like the way she frames it. Okay, we're down into the last 15 minutes and we still have the ownership circle to get through. So let's talk, we talked about the family circle and the business circle. That video kind of aligned both of the conversations that we need to have in terms of, the social side for the family and the emotional readiness, but also some of those kind of policies and procedures that are best practice to ensure that we can mitigate as much the conflict that we know is inevitable in the model. Okay, so let's talk about the ownership circle now. So really the ownership of family business, I think we pay maybe the least attention to this circle, simply because a lot of times it's very limited. In the first generations, it's maybe 1 or 2 owners, and their shareholders meetings are basically, they get together to sign the minutes and get them up to their lawyers once a year in a lot of cases. Again, which is why I'm so excited that the rest of this series is going to really talk about some of that transactional stuff. But when you're looking at also all of a sudden, in a group of siblings, potentially 3 owners that need to work together. When you look at a group of cousins, potentially 8 to 10 cousins that need to work together, we need to really define what the role of owner is, and what does it mean to be an owner, and how do I become an owner? So really thinking about some of those critical decisions that need to be made. And then as owners, what are some of those how is our our mechanism for consensus in terms of group decision making? And so what are some of those things that they're going to need to be thinking about as owners in a family business? First and foremost, going back to my previous comments, ensuring that the information is flowing from the family circle up to the owners, from the business circle up to the owners, all of that critical information that they need to make decisions as owners, making sure that that flow of information is established so that they can talk about defining things like the strategic priorities for the business. Where are we going now from, as a new group of owners? What is our vision for this business now going forward? Are we talking about new products? Are we looking at diversifying? Are we looking at expansion or expanding into new markets? Are we looking at our customer rates? Do we need to attract investment for growth, and how are we doing that? And how are we increasing revenues? Because as business people, we all know if you're not growing, you're dying. So how are we ensuring that we're growing that business? And when you look at multi-generational transition, when you go from to like maybe an owner founder, husband and wife, all of a sudden going down to siblings, well, all of a sudden you've gone from needing a business that supports 1 family to needing a business that supports 3 families. And then again, more complex when you get into the cousins, because then all of a sudden you've gone from a business that supports 3 families to a business that all of a sudden supports 8 to 10 family members, or to 8 to 10 families. So you really need to be constantly thinking about the growth of the asset, the business, and the growth of the other assets, whether they be investment assets or real estate assets. So really thinking about that is important too. Other things that owners really need to be thinking about from a family enterprise perspective is the defining the ownership policies. for both family and non-family. If you remember, there is that two position at the top of the circle for those non-family owners that can come in as potential investors. What are our policies for the family and those non-family owners? Who gets to be an owner? How do they become an owner? What are the expectations of ownership? So what do we expect from you as individuals in terms of being really progressive and thoughtful owners for this business? What is the responsibility of ownership? And then what is our model? What model are we currently in? So, the owner-operator model is that senior generation working together. The siblings would be in a partnership model. The cousins would be in a distributed model. And then we look at nested or public, and what that means is there's different groups of owners within the same company, depending on how big it is. We need to be thinking about the advisory board. So in the business circle, that's the key governance to support really successful transition. But the responsibility for appointing those people falls on the shareholders. That is their responsibility to ensure that they're selecting. And maybe I just want to, I talked about advisory boards being key governance, but what I didn't do is make the distinction between the fact that there's a big difference between a fiduciary board of directors and an advisory board. An advisory board is not fiduciary. It's much more relaxed in terms of how they run and operate. And really the intent of an advisory board is just to create a consortium of unbiased and independent people outside your family and business that can provide some, just some different expertise and relevance to the decisions that are being made, and do it in a way that's not with the family lens on it or not with the business lens on it. And so the importance of really, electing or appointing those individuals falls to that group of shareholders, but it needs to be done in a really thoughtful and methodical way so that you can get the most impact. Other roles and responsibilities that you'll see as owners is, of course, monitoring business results and approving any major expansions or transactions. And I'm not going to go through all of this in detail, other than to say this is, when you go back to the comments from the video, just making sure that we're doing that business 101, right? And that our owners have really good business acumen, that they have those analytical skills, and understand what a P&L is and a balance sheet, and what those mean to the decisions that they're making, and that they are responsible for all of those things: the income, the expenses, the assets, liabilities, and capital. So just making sure that somehow we're providing that education or we're either providing it or we're requiring it before they can come into the ownership circle. And then defining dividend policies. So are we distributing, are we reinvesting the profits of the company? Making sure that we're always taking into consideration the stability of the balance sheet and the income statement, and really making sure that we're doing it in line with the sector that we're in terms of other payouts, and also looking at the needs of the ownership group, because again, a dividend policy can be one of the most dividing aspects of a family enterprise, because obviously you have lots of different family members. If they own shares and aren't working in the business, a lot of times they're in a harvest mentality, so they absolutely want to maximize the dividends. So they'll have a much different perspective than that owner that's running the business that really needs that income to reinvest or to grow the business. And so essentially those are kind of the 5 key critical areas that we need to be thinking about in the ownership circle, and those owners need to be considering. But again, with the input and expertise from the other 2 circles feeding up to that. And like I said, I think a lot of times we spend a lot of time with our family, and we spend a lot of time thinking about the business, or we spend more time thinking about the business than any other circle, but we forget that we need to really be grooming individuals in the next generation, not just to run the business, but to be really good shareholders. And so the key governance is this establishment of an ownership council and all of those policies that I just talked about around dividends, etc. Okay, so the very last video I'm going to share with you is Maria Sinasis, and she's going to talk about, actually she talks a lot about the stuff that I just broke down, But it's really about this idea of ownership being a job. So whether or not you're working in the business, if you are an owner, you really need to be taking it seriously and preparing yourself and educating yourself to be a really effective owner for that family enterprise. Okay, so
ownership of a family business is a job. Ownership is not a birthright. It's very hard because we treat it as a birthright sometimes. But what we're coming together to say is that your families are growing, your ownership group is becoming more complex, your businesses are becoming more complex, and based on the needs of the family and the business, it's really important to say that this is a job and we have to take it seriously. Here are the decisions from a best practice standpoint of owners. So defining the owner's strategic goals for the company, amending the company bylaws, amending the shareholder structure, electing board members, monitoring the performance overall, approving major changes, major transactions, and approving the dividend policy. It's a job. We have to get into position as owners to be able to contribute appropriately, right, when called upon. What if there is a family member who isn't interested or as passionate? You know, they should have the freedom to step away and to not be as active, but to still understand the role of an owner. A family that we know was an industry leader. They had capable management and a strong board, and they decided to sell their family business. So post-liquidity, the message to the family was, find your passion, you know, do what you love. As the post-liquidity state of the family evolved, they were investing in a lot of different types of businesses. And over time, they found the need for the owners to have skills, even though they were out there pursuing their passions, to understand their new role as owners. They were now owners of a portfolio of businesses, and they really needed to understand what kind of skills and capabilities they needed, whether they could serve on the boards, etc. So it's really important to look at the needs of the family and the needs of the business and to constantly keep a pulse.
okay, so a lot of the same stuff I said, just keeping in mind that within this system, we want to be thinking about all of the circles, the decisions that need to be made within those circles, but also how are those decisions being shared. And again, this has just been a really high level overview. There's a lot of complexity around the outputs. So for instance, in the family circle, the result of family meetings would be down the road through time, the establishment of a family constitution that will capture all of the history, but will also put in place some of those policies that the family defines around things like employment. So with that, I think we have about 4 minutes for questions. So didn't leave a lot of time, Michael, but if there are any questions, I'm happy to take those because that was a lot of information.
Yeah, that was great. And you touched on P&Ls and financial statements, and one of the episodes that Drew's going to run for us is wholly on financial literacy, financial statement literacy, so that everybody has a equal basis from which to start. I like today's a lot there about. I think it's just good to put the inevitable conflict on the radar, right?
Well, and knowing that it's coming, how can we manage and mitigate that the best that we can by being really clear and articulate about what are some of those policies and what are some of those expectations, because it's really hard for family members to operate in silos without getting all of the information that they need, because it just creates more confusion and conflict. And in lack of a story, we create one, right? So a lot of that's going on in family enterprises, and we just, as much as possible, want to ensure that we provide them with tools and resources to help them with that process more successfully.
Yeah, in wrapping up today and what we'll be wrapping up, the two presentations you gave us before we go into the finer points of actually transferring the business, I just want to thank you for joining us and for giving us this. When we first spoke about this and you explained that, you know, the interpersonal and the emotional and psychological hurdles of this, they're profound. And these last two webinars, I just think are super valuable. And I think they're incredibly valuable for our next presenters, being Drew and Hillary, because they can always point people back to these first two to say, you know, like, do your due diligence, do your homework, have these conversations. Because you're just, I mean, it's human nature. We're going to have to circle back if you don't, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, this was wonderful. Thank you so much. And it's 12:59, so I'll give everybody one whole minute to finish your lunch, go to the bathroom, and make it to your 1 o'clock meeting. Thank you again, Shauna. It's been wonderful. I hope in the future maybe we can do this more thoroughly, less rushed. But this is an introduction, and we wanted to get it onto our community's radar that, you know, these services are available, and we don't want those businesses to necessarily just close down.
Yeah, and before we end, if I could, I'll just do a quick plug. I know that you shared our website, so I'd encourage people to go there. Right now, we actually have, you know, that masterclass that I was referring to, that full 16 hours of sessions is currently running, and another intake will start in September. So if you are a family that thinks they want to learn more and actually delve into how to establish some of this governance and some of these policies, that's a great place. And those are all free, compliments of Community Futures, Highwood. And we also next week have, every month we run a family enterprise leadership series, which is over a lunch again, but it's just high level, different topics and content. So I would just encourage, there's a lot of, and that's all of it's free. It's all sponsored content. So anybody can jump on that stuff. And if they found these two sessions interesting, they can dive a little bit deeper and learn some more. And thank you, Michael, for having me. It's been my pleasure.
No, thanks for having it, for doing this for us. We appreciate it very much. And thanks to Highwood. I never said that previously. Well, I hope everyone enjoyed this as much as I did. And yeah, enjoy the remainder of your summer.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Take care.
Bye.